Welcome to Lesson 5 of our Cultural Competency Training. My name is Desiree Cochran-Norfolk, and in today's lesson we're going to be talking about gender and sexism. So in this lesson we're going to dive into how gender and sexism show up in our counseling work, both in the subtle ways and in overt systemic patterns. When I say gender, I'm not just talking about biological sex. We're looking at gender identity, gender expression, and the ways people are socialized into roles that may either support their well-being or cause harm. We're also going to take a closer look at sexism, which is the structural and interpersonal ways that inequality is maintained. We're going to talk about privilege, oppression, and what all of that means in the counseling room. And I'm also going to highlight resilience because despite the heavy impact of sexism, people and communities develop powerful strategies for survival and also for growth. And so as we're going through this lesson, I'm going to encourage you to reflect on your own experiences, how gender roles shaped you growing up, how those messages are going to continue to influence your worldview today. So let's start with some key definitions here. Gender refers to the social roles, the behaviors, and identities that cultures are attaching to being male and female or non-binary. It's dynamic, so it shifts across time and place. Transgender individuals identify with a gender that differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. Genderqueer and non-binary folks may not identify exclusively as male or female. Intersex describes people born with physical or genetic traits that don't fit typical binary definitions of male or female. Now, sexism is discrimination based on gender, and it can be both explicit and subtle. And it's often going to intersect with other forms of oppression like racism or classism. Then we have internalized sexism, which is when women or gender minorities absorb negative societal messages that turn them inward. Male privilege is going to refer to the unearned advantages that men, especially cisgendered men, have in a patriarchal society. And as counselors, when we use those terms, we're not talking about abstract theories. We're talking about lived realities that are going to influence our clients' mental health every day. And these realities are going to shape self-esteem. It's going to affect opportunities and even the client's life expectancy. So it's crucial that we name them very clearly. When we think about counseling women and girls, there's a few things to keep in mind. First, women and girls often carry the weight of conflicting expectations. We're told to be nurturing and agreeable and accommodating and humble. And at the same time, we're also told to be ambitious and independent and self-sufficient. And these competing demands can generate anxiety and perfectionism and imposter syndrome. So let's pause here for a second and look at this case study. And we want to keep in mind that there is a real life story to ground these ideas. So Deborah's a 42-year-old married African-American woman who has made an appointment with you because she states, I don't know what to do anymore. I think I'm depressed and I'm hoping that you can kind of help me sort it out. So she reveals during your first session that she's recently re-entered the workforce because her 2 children are soon going to be heading to college and the family needs a second income. And she also explains that she has seen 4 other counselors and they were not helpful. So as the session is beginning, Deborah slumps in her chair and she exhales loudly and avoids eye contact. In a muted voice and tearfully and almost in a whisper, she says, I really don't think that this is going to make any difference. My husband thinks that I need to see someone and I just think he wants me off his back. So from a gender-sensitive perspective, what would you say to Deborah? How would you feel about working with her? What might be some gender-specific themes that come up during your sessions? How might your beliefs about men and women influence your reaction to Deborah's strong emotions? How does Deborah's race impact your reaction to her? How might things be different if Deborah were a man? Sometimes the counselor and the client are going to have conflicting values regarding gender roles and oppression. So how does a counselor decide whether or not to challenge a client's beliefs regarding women's oppression? That case study is in your handout. So I also want to highlight that the American Psychological Association developed specific guidelines for psychological practice with girls and women. So we're going to be providing these in the handout so that you have a practical resource. And as you're going through these guidelines, I want you to think about how they might shift the way that you listen to female clients. Are you paying attention to how sexism affects their goals? Are you helping them see how much of what they carry isn't a personal failure, but systemic oppression? Women don't just come to counseling as isolated individuals. They come in as mothers, daughters, students, workers, people that are navigating intersecting roles and systems that sometimes support them, but often oppress them. Now, let's talk about counseling men, and I want you to just take a moment to reflect. How were you taught what boys do or what men do when you were growing up? I want you to compile a list of messages that you received from your parents, your friends, your community, the media about male behavior. How do these messages contribute to your beliefs about what are the right and wrong ways for boys and men to behave? How might messages given to males influence their mental health? So, for men, one concept that shows up is normative male alexithymia. And this is a fancy term for something many of you have probably noticed. Boys and men are often socialized not to express emotions, except maybe anger. So they grow up hearing messages like, boys don't cry, man up, toughen up, suck it up, things like that. So in your reflection question, I want you to think about how you were taught what boys or men do. Just take a moment to think about it. What kind of messages did you receive? And how might these messages affect the way that you work with your male clients? Another framework is the code of masculinity. So Terry Real described how the price for girls is often oppression, being confined to like kindness or niceness. But for boys, the price is disconnection, disconnection from their feelings, from other people, and often from themselves. So just think for a moment, how does that resonate with your own story? If you were male, or if you are male, how has disconnection shaped you? And if you're not male, how do you see these patterns playing out in the men around you? As counselors, we need to remember that men's struggle with vulnerability in relationships. They struggle with relationships, period, or even help-seeking behavior. Those aren't just individual quirks within individual people. Those are across the board. They're deeply tied into cultural gender socialization. So helping men expand their emotional range can really be life-saving work. And counseling transgender clients is going to require intentionally ongoing education for us and a little bit of humility. Transgenders are going to, those people are going to face high rates of discrimination, violence, unemployment, rejection by their families and their communities. And a lot of them are reporting negative experiences with counselors or medical providers. And that can include misgendering or ignorance about trans issues. So our role is to create an affirming space. And that means using correct names and pronouns. We want to explore gender identity without imposing our assumptions. We want to recognize the resilience and creativity that trans clients bring to survival. And I'm also provided a list of resources like websites like gender.org and nctequality.org, so that you have some reliable places to turn for education for yourself. As counselors, we don't need to know everything, but we do need to know how to listen deeply and respect identities and connect clients with resources and advocacy. And so for trans clients, even one affirming professional relationship can make an enormous difference for them. Now let's jump into sexism. This doesn't just show up in personal interactions. It's kind of baked into our history. During World War II, women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. But when that war ended, a lot of them were pushed back into the home and told that their real place was in domestic roles. And that return reinforced the idea that women's labor was temporary, secondary, and expendable. So, of course, there's always the feminist movement, waves of resistance to sexism. They demanded equal rights in education and employment and healthcare and politics. And those movements weren't perfect. They sometimes excluded women of color, working class women, LGBTQ women, but they planted seeds of transformation that are continuing today. So understanding this history is going to matter because clients don't arrive in a vacuum. The pressures and the opportunities that they're experiencing are tied to generations of gender struggles. So we have to kind of connect the dots between the past and the present. Gender is not experienced in the same way across cultures. So for African American women, strength and resilience are often expected, but this strong Black woman stereotype can invalidate real suffering and discourage help seeking. For Asian American women, cultural messages might emphasize modesty and obedience or family duty, and all of that can conflict with dominant US norms of independence. For Latino cultures, we see concepts like machoism for men and Marianoism for women. These are powerful cultural scripts that can empower and constrain. For Arab American women, we have issues of modesty, family honor, religious expectations, and that's going to intersect with the Western stereotypes about oppression. So as counselors, our job is not to pathologize the cultural values, but to understand them in context. So we need to ask, like, how does this value serve the client? How might it create stress? How do cultural messages intersect with the sexism to affect their mental health? And sexism has really clear mental health impacts. Women are more likely than men to experience depression, not because of biology alone, but because of the chronic exposure to inequality and double shifts of work and social devaluations and whatever. So eating disorders, this is another example. The cultural obsession with thinness is going to target girls and women relentlessly. Body surveillance, objectification, media pressures, all of that's going to feed into it. And when the clients are presenting with those concerns, then we have to ask, what role has sexism played in shaping those symptoms? Because without that lens, we're risking treating the surface problem while ignoring the root cause. And beyond mental health, sexism has physical consequences, like limited access to reproductive health care, higher rates of intimate partner violence, disparities in medical treatment. The list can go on and on. And it has social consequences, like the imposter phenomenon. Women, especially in those male-dominated fields, are going to feel like frauds despite any competence that they have. And that's not an individual failing, it's a predictable outcome of working in environments that are constantly questioning their legitimacy. And so when the client is describing imposter feelings, it's helpful to normalize them as systemic, not proof that something is wrong with the client themselves. So how do we address this in our counseling work? The ACA's advocacy competencies kind of provide a roadmap for us. They ask us to identify the strengths and resources of the female and the transgender clients first. We need to identify social, political, and economic barriers that they're facing and help the clients to name and challenge those external obstacles. We want to train our clients in self-advocacy skills and partner with our clients to carry out those action plans. And sometimes that's going to look like helping a client advocate for herself at work. Sometimes it means supporting lobbying efforts for reproductive rights or healthcare access. Sometimes it means encouraging men as feminists. Men who share power, raise consciousness, and those types of men that are going to work alongside the women for equity. So lastly, let's talk about resilience here. Women and gender minorities are not just victims of sexism. They're also survivors. They're leaders, they're innovators, and they've developed collective practices like consciousness raising groups, social movements, mentoring networks, just social circles. And they've used storytelling and art and all types of things, including protest, as like a vehicle for empowerment. So, as counselors, we should not only validate the harm of sexism, but also highlight resilience. Think about this. What kind of strategies have clients used in the past to cope? And how do their communities support those? How can those strengths be harnessed in therapy? And importantly here, how do we as counselors commit to social justice, to changing the conditions that are keeping sexism alive? Our work is not just about supporting individuals, but also about contributing to a society where equality and dignity are truly possible.